Excited here to pick up in a series we've been in for a couple of weeks here called The Grown-Up Table. And this has been a super great series, a challenging one as well. And if you've missed any of these weeks, make sure that you catch up online if you want to. We have a YouTube channel, on our Facebook, all of those places you normally find it, on the website as well. Would love to have you catch up on it. But basically, we've been talking about this. The Grown-Up Table idea is our journey from immaturity to maturity. And some of you are still on that journey. Some of you have arrived there. You know, all those things. Here's what I like to say about maturity. It's my favorite thing, Grant, because I like to be funny. I like to have fun. And I got a lot of trouble in school all the time for like speaking out of turn, like trying to be funny, all of those things. And people are like, you just need to be mature. And I'm like, mature sounds awful. It sounds super boring. I think it's just knowing when to shift gears. So keep being you, keep being funny, all of those things. Sorry for all the teachers in the room that I just ousted with that. But would love to, on this journey of immaturity to maturity, where we think about this journey, what we don't get to do is pick where we started. And you might think about your family situation. You didn't get to pick that. You didn't get to pick who you were born into, right? That family, you're like, that would be a nice choice, honestly. You're like, if we could change that. You don't get to pick what happens to you over your life. We don't even get to pick the circumstances in which we arrive in, right? All of those things are just kind of already built in. But what we do get to pick on our journey from immaturity to maturity is we get to pick how we will respond to those things, right? How we'll respond to our family, how we'll respond to the things going on in our lives. And that's really what we're talking about, right? We're not talking about going back to change things like your family. We're not talking about going back and just wishing we didn't have those circumstances, right? We're talking about the things we can do, which is how we respond. So it's been a joy to walk through as we look at the story of Joseph. So I do encourage you, if you missed some of those, go back and catch these last couple of weeks. But if you're just jumping in today, that'll be great as well. I was thinking about this. When I think about the grown-up table, it also makes me think about the kids' table. And I shared with those of you who were here last week how my grandparents had this yellow suitcase that like folded into a table somehow. I used to think it was like the coolest thing on earth. We got to sit there as kids, and my kids sat on it last weekend when we were over there. They like opened it up, it folded up. It was not nearly as exciting as I remembered it being, but there it was, and it brought this flood of memories back to me. And one of the things I remember about the kids' table is kind of how the disputes worked at the kids' table. I don't know if you're close enough to remember that, or if you have some memories of. I was the cause of a lot of disputes. If you would imagine that for a second, I know it's very hard. So I would often like throw things. I just thought it was fun to push buttons and like get a reaction from people. It was kind of like my game. And so these disputes would happen at the kids' day, right? You got all the cousins around, both sides of my family. We had a lot of cousins and like my siblings, and so we were always getting into trouble over there. And most of the time, it was far enough away where the adults could just, how we do that. Parents sometimes we're like, do I have to care? No one's screaming. I mean, it sounds like something's happening, but how long do we let this go? And eventually, someone would have to come over and settle down the chaos over there, or one of the cousins or the siblings would get up and go tattle on you, which, not cool. But that's what would happen. And so someone would come over, and there would be these disputes, and they're like, well, I threw a fork, and then he threw a spoon. And it's like, that's okay. Well, he makes a good point. You threw the fork first, so he did throw the spoon. He's like, well, that was after he pulled my chair out from under me. And he's like, okay, another solid point for him. And so you're kind of navigating this, right? You're helping your kids. You're playing referee a little bit. But what ends up happening is this, and I know this because I have kids too now, is there's this tension because I want them to learn how to forgive and say you're sorry and all those things. But also sometimes it feels like you're making them do it. Do you remember the adults coming over and they're like, what do you say? And the kid's like, sorry. They're like, say it louder so he can hear you. I'm sorry. And they're like, look up. And he's like, I'm sorry. And he's like, I don't like you. And then you force them to do it, and they're like, okay, well, what do you have to say? And they're like, I forgive you. And they're like, would you open your mouth when you say it? You don't have marbles in there. Just say it. And they're like, I forgive you. Right? And it's like this really forced thing, and then at the end, you're left wondering, is it worth it? Did that do anything at all? Right? It didn't really seem that sincere. And they're like, did you mean it? And he's like, not really. Like, then why'd you say it? Like, because you told me to. And you're like, a solid point again, right? So all these things are happening. And what we realize, though, the importance that we see here is that someone's modeling it for us, right? Someone is coming into that equation and saying, hey, forgiveness is needed here, right? Like, there's something that needs to happen here because there was this dispute. It's why I make my children do it, right? And I try not to just make them do it all the time. Like, why do you think that that was a bad idea. And even though it's like completely obvious that you shouldn't do that thing, right? And they think through it, and they eventually, right, they model it. They know what they're supposed to do, right? So we model that for them. But what happens is we eventually move to the adult table. If you've been privileged enough to move up yet, if some of you have been held back, I'm sorry about that. But eventually you move up. And like we talked about last week, what we learn in the story of Joseph, even when we move up, when things seem like they're going well, what we realize about the kids' table is they all grew up too. All the problems came with us to the adult table, right? Joseph, last week in the story, we looked at the source of all of his pain in his life showed up at his doorstep, right? There was still more to do there. But here's the difference at the adult table, right? Forgiveness is definitely still needed, maybe even more so. We're definitely more aware of the need for it. But what happens at the adult table is no one rushes in anymore to model it. Right? No one comes to the grown-up table and sits down with you like, all right, listen, you two, what do you say? Like, I'm sorry. Like, no one does that for us anymore. Right? When we come to the grown-up table, forgiveness is our decision. Right? Forgiveness is our responsibility. Right? All of these things become true. Because here's the reality, right? Every family hurts each other in some way at some point. Sometimes it's very, very bad, very, very painful. Other times it's what we would, and I don't even know if it's normal, but right, there are sources of pain in every family, right? And every family says something, every family does something that someone does right? It's part of being family. We annoy each other, right? And eventually those annoyances sometimes cause pain. What often happens at the adult table, though, is instead of forgiving, oftentimes we might just ignore it. If I don't think about it, it doesn't exist. Solid strategy, right? No. Right? And sometimes we make excuses for it, or other people make excuses for bad behavior on our part or on someone else's part. Well, it's just the way they are. They've always been like that. If you just don't say that thing, you're like, that's a total normal thing to say. I should be able to say, please pass the potatoes, right? You're like, it's a normal thing. They're like, just, how they, right? Might make excuses. Right? Often as families and adults, we might just dismiss things. Well, maybe I did something. I just sweep it under the rug, right? Like, oh, well, it's just, words. Doesn't really matter, right? There's a tone set. And then the negativity of that begins, right? We might dismiss the offense. And many times we end up sitting in the seat of judgment, right? Maybe we don't say anything. We don't even engage in it when we're hurt, but oftentimes we look and we say, well, I would never do that. I can't believe they've done that. How could they, right? We sit in the seat of judgment and we start to look at them in a different way. All of these things are true, and no one, when we come to the grown-up table, rushes in to make it happen because it's our decision. Sometimes every single thing except for forgiveness happens at the grown-up table. We try every other way. People try every other way. We try to just not see each other, right? We just don't talk to each other. We just sit at opposite ends of the table. Every single thing happens. Why? Because we're scared to approach forgiveness because it's tricky, right? Forgiveness is hard. It's largely undefined. Actually, I think this is probably true of forgiveness. Forgiveness is one of the few important decisions we make without knowing the outcome. When we make the decision to forgive someone, or someone makes the decision to forgive us, we don't always know what that's going to look like. Most of the time, probably. We don't know how that's always going to be received. We don't even know what's going on in their life, right? We don't know. And that can be incredibly frightening. Like I said, we've been following this story of Joseph, and he has a pretty intense story. If you've ever read the story of Joseph over the Bible, or if you've been following along with us, just to give you a short recap here, Joseph started out as his father's favorite son. So I have that in common with Joseph. I'll ask my brother about it later, but I think he'll probably agree, right? So he started out as his father's favorite son. A really interesting thing for a father to do, right? And he was not quiet about it, right? He told the other brothers this. He actually gave Joseph gifts to just make sure it sunk in for them. He's like, see, he's my favorite. Look at this. Right? He did these things. And what happened is his other brothers, right? It's fine if you're an only child, I guess, because you are the only child. But if you have brothers and sisters, it's pretty painful. And what happened is the brothers started to notice this. They started to see it, and it bothered them, right? To the point where as Joseph as a young man was just doing more and more things and living this, they decided they had to get rid of him, right? They decided their first idea was they were going to kill him. And then they said, well, that might not go too well. So what if we just sell him into slavery instead? So then he'll probably die and we won't have to do it at our hands, right? It's probably what they were thinking. So they sell him into slavery thinking they'll be gone of him forever. And then they lie to the father about what happened. Joseph's life had some ups and downs, hills and valleys. Through it, we see that he was committed to following what God has laid out for him, right? Being a man of God, he's followed that path through the highs and lows. And finally, he arrives at a spot where he is a ruler of Egypt, where we landed last week. For all intents and purposes, like he made it. He did it. He never has to see his family again. He's like a ruler of Egypt. They don't even know he's alive. He could start a new identity. Like he doesn't have to ever see them again. And what happens is his brothers show up at his doorstep. And they have a decision, Joseph has a decision to make in this moment. Right? He was in a position in authority where he could have them killed. He could have them thrown in prison, right? He could retaliate against them. But Joseph, because he knows what God would want, he started to follow him. He knows that he gives a gift of life, right? He allows them to live. He tests them a little bit. He's trying to figure out if they're trustworthy. But he ends up saying, hey, bring my whole family to Egypt. He reveals himself to them, right? They're terrified, right? Joseph responds in a way where he gives them the unexpected. In that moment, it doesn't talk about forgiveness. We see that here a little bit later where we're going to pick up, right? Some time has passed. So Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And it says they were so terrified they couldn't even speak because they were probably like, what is happening? He's going to kill us. So they end up going back, and Joseph says, bring our whole family here. I'm going to take care of you. You're going to live in the land, right? Everything seems good. Some time passes, and their father, Jacob, who they brought back, was already old at that point, but he has died. And we pick up right after their father has died, and here's what it says in Genesis chapter 50, if you want to turn there with us in chapter 50, verse 15. If you don't have a Bible, there's some in the seats in front of you. If you don't own one, we'd love for you to take that home if you want to read it. And here's what it says in Genesis chapter 50, verse 15. It says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all of the wrongs we did to him? So they send word to Joseph saying, your father has left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? So you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for your children. And he reassured them and spoke to them kindly. Just like we saw last week when they bring this up to Joseph, right? He wept for them. Right, his heart is guided towards them. But Joseph has this decision. And we might read this and be like, man, that was so nice of Joseph. He just must be a really good guy. If you have ever been hurt before, I think you know that that's probably just not true. And I'm guessing that none of you were sold into slavery like Joseph here, right? This is not a story about Joseph just being a really good guy. Right, see, what was true for Joseph here, what he understood, he's in a position of authority over his brothers. We're getting towards the end of the story here, and this decision isn't just about how great of a person Joseph is, but it's about how much he trusted in the promise of God. See, what Joseph understood as a promise that God gave him, exactly what he said here in the end, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done. Right? He had the bigger picture. He sees what God is doing, and he is committed to that. Right? Even in this moment where he says, I'm going to forgive you after his brother has died. The book of Romans would put it this way. It's a promise that we have as well. It says this, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. What we see here is not a promise for health, wealth, and happiness and everything we've ever dreamed of. What this promise is that no matter what we go through in this life, God is going to accomplish what he has planned to accomplish all along. That's a great promise because we each live in different circumstances. We have difficulty in our life that we couldn't even describe to other people. And what this means is that no matter that, God, who's the author of our faith, or he's the perfecter, what he's going to do is work that for good. Right? Whether we see it in this lifetime or it's our hope and eternity with him, God will use it. There is no way that you could tell me Joseph would have thought in like, if somebody was like, don't worry, I know you got sold into slavery, but God works things out for those who love him. And they like thumbs up and they walk away. Like, I don't think he would have been in the mood, frankly, right, for that. He's probably like, get away from me. Right? This and what Joseph is doing here is after years of seeing and living in this promise that God has given him. See, we often view forgiveness as work that we have to do, right? It's like a checklist. When in reality, what forgiveness really is a decision that we make where we give up control of what's to come, right? We have to make that decision, and then we don't exactly know what the path will be. But God promises that he's bigger than any circumstance or anything that's happening in our life. He's bigger than one decision. His grace covers my sin and the sins of others. Whether I'm the one who needs to give forgiveness or I'm the one who wants to receive forgiveness. Right? God is bigger than any of those things. The problem is, though, sometimes, at least I know in my heart, and I think many of ours, is that our heart isn't always ready to forgive. Right? There's times where what happens is in our heart we believe things even about God that are a hang-up to when we want to forgive people. Let me give you a couple examples that I thought of this week. Often we view God as someone who is punishing us with circumstances, who is punishing us with pain in our lives. If we view that God is punishing us or punishing others with things, what happens is when we go to want to forgive someone, we think we need to punish them too because it's how God has interacted with us. Right? That's not who God is. Right? We often get to a place where we're like, I'll forgive them, but I really want them to feel at least half as bad as I have. You ever been there? Because I have before. Like I want to forgive them, but I'd like to know that they're in like a little bit of pain. I'd like them to stub their toe really badly this week. That if I knew that, we'd be okay. Right? We're just like, we get in that spot where like punishment would equal my ability to forgive. And if we view God that way, that he's punishing us, and that's what makes it worthy of us being in, that's not how God works. Often we think that God doesn't care about our pain, that he's dismissing it. What happens is that God's actually redeeming it. That's how he's working out for good. But if I believe that God is dismissing my pain and he's not present with me in my life and in my pain, then I'll brush it off. Maybe I deserved it. God doesn't really care about this. I just need to get over it. I need to just work really hard not to care about it. Right? We try to muster the strength. It's not who God is. Oftentimes when we approach forgiveness, we view it as being totally dependent on the other person. Right? Hey, I'll forgive them if they come to me and own up to what they did. And I'll do it. You're like, I'll do it then. But then they got it. Like we make a checklist and we're like, if I just wait around and if they want to do it, they'll do it. If they care about me, they'll come to me. Right? We put forgiveness totally on the other person. Right? I think it's these beliefs and some of the others that make forgiveness so difficult sometimes because it alters what forgiveness is actually talked about when we look at what the Bible says. Okay, so like, what do I need to believe? What do I do? How do I get this? Well, let me tell you right away, it's not a 3-step process. It could be 150. It's not really a step process. Right? What forgiveness is a heart decision towards someone. Here's what I mean by that is that when we think about how do I know that I'm ready for forgiveness, I would say this is I think we're ready to walk the path of forgiveness when our heart becomes for the other person. This is difficult. I don't usually like the people that hurt me. I don't know if I'm like alone in that. I'm usually not like, let's be friends. That would be nice. Right? When my heart becomes for the other person. But here, let me make an important distinction here. Forgiveness and reconciliation, I believe, are 2 separate things. I think forgiveness is a decision that we make to set ourselves up for the possibility of whatever God wants to do. If that's reconciliation and we have relationship again, wonderful. It would be beautiful. Even if I forgive someone, I may not have relationship with them. But what forgiveness is when my heart becomes for the other person, even if I don't see them again. Even if they've already passed away, right? It's not about when they've met my list of demands. It's not when they've behaved well enough. It's not about when I feel like they've redeemed themselves, right? It's not when I feel like it's done, right? Forgiveness is a decision that we make at the front end of things on a promise that God has given us. Joseph he forgave his brothers first. Relationship happened later. It was a choice that he made in his heart. Then we walk the path. That's the scary part. The scary part is we don't know what the path is. We don't know where it's going to lead. We don't know what it's going to take to get it all the way there. Because often we think only about reconciliation. We're like, that just could never happen. It might not. Forgiveness is not that thing. It's a totally different thing. It's when our heart is for someone. I love the way that the gospel works because this is how it works with our relationship with God. He's not punishing us. He's not out to get us. Here's what happened is, yes, sin is a real thing that separates us from God. The Bible's really clear about that. We look at God's heart for us. When God gave us forgiveness, he didn't do it so he could prove that he was God. He didn't need to do that. He didn't do it because he had some need that he needed to fill. He's God. He doesn't need it. Why did God do it? Because his heart was for us. His heart was for us not to live in pain. Here, when God sent his son Jesus to this earth to live and die and suffer for us as believers, to have a relationship with him, it wasn't because he needed it. It was because his heart was grieved for us. He said, I created these children of mine, and I'm not in relationship with them anymore, and I want to forgive them. I want to find a way to do that. The way that he found to do that was by sending his son. And we see his heart on display here in John 3:16 and 17. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Jesus didn't come to make us feel terrible about who we are and make us to live in guilt and shame. In the same way, when we offer forgiveness, we're not trying to make people feel guilty and shameful about it, right? If we're doing it the way that God would want us to do it, forgiveness is alleviating that. Forgiveness is moving towards them. Our heart becomes for them so that we would get to a place where we're like, I just hate that my family is broken. I hate that my brother is someone I can't talk to. I hate that this person felt so alone that they had to attack me. I hate that this person felt so insecure. I hate that they felt so guilty and shameful about what they did that they just treated me poorly the rest of my life. You see how that's different than many times what we think of. I can't believe they did, right? If we are able to receive forgiveness from God in the way that he describes here, we begin to see that his heart was for us. And so when we move towards people with forgiveness, it's when our heart is for them that we know that we're ready to move towards it. Same thing with the relationship with Jesus. We accept that forgiveness at the front end, and then we walk a path. Does God want our life to change? Absolutely. Am I doing some things wrong that I should do a different way? Absolutely. Is God withholding things from me? No. His heart is for me. My best interest is in mind. Man, when we forgive people, could we get to a spot where our heart is for them, that their best interest is in our mind? That's truly what forgiveness ends up being. So if we're going to come to the grown-up table with forgiveness here, and no one's making us do that, what do I have to think about? Well, a couple of things here is this. One, forgiveness isn't about me coming to get something. It can no longer be about that. Forgiveness is about me going to someone because my heart is grieved that there is pain between us, right? It's bringing it before God in this way, right? Forgiveness is really this. Forgiveness is giving up control of the situation that we're in and trusting that God intends things for good. So often when we forgive people, we want to control how it works because we're like in a perfect scenario, it would go this way and then this would happen and we could do this, we could have this conversation and then they could do this over here and you're mapping it all out and it's exhausting. And then they deviate from the path a little bit, they hurt you a little bit again and the whole thing's off. Right? People are going to hurt you again. That's kind of how life works because we're not perfect. The best way to prepare for this that I can think of, one, is to understand how God thinks of us, how he forgives us, right? That he would extend forgiveness to us before we even knew that it was available, right? That he would extend forgiveness to us even at our worst moment, right? Even extend forgiveness to us when we have previously rejected him in our life. Because his heart is for us in this way. And so we approach God with whatever situation is. We're like, I'm going to give up control of this situation. The path is going to be what it's going to be. Right? If it leads to reconciliation, it's actually awesome. But God, I want my heart to be for others like your heart was for me. That's how we arrive at forgiveness. And Joseph got there. Right? In pretty terrible circumstances. As we prepare to give forgiveness and we experience it, we first have to own our sin and our mistakes with God. Right? We figure out what is our relationship going to be with Jesus and who is he going to be in our life. The next thing is that we often have to own up to things in our own life because even if someone has hurt us, we have to look at ourselves as well. The Bible would put it this way. In Matthew chapter 7, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? It's just a great visual of like a plank. When you look around, it's like going everywhere. How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. I love this passage because it paints a picture that we so often do. Oftentimes we go and we want to get this forgiveness from people. We think they owe us something. And you've experienced this before. You've been on both sides of it where you go and you're like, do you know that thing you did to me? I can't believe you did that to me. And they're like, thing I did to you? Do you know who you are, what you did to me? Right? You've been there. Right? It just starts to be a shouting match because what's happening? It's this scenario playing out. You're like, speck. And they're like, plank. And you're like, plank. Right? You start to realize it too. You get in these circles of arguments and then you're like, oh. And besides that fact, things that we say like, oh, I would never do that to anyone. I can't believe they would do that. And then 3 months later, you find yourself, oh, crap, I did that thing. Oh, no, I said I wouldn't do that. Right? We realize, man, there's more to this than just the other person. Right? We have to own our part. And I love this because when we are willing to own our part in it, whatever it might be, or to at least examine, do we have a part in it? Right? We're willing to like take that plank out, examine our problems. What happens is then we will see clearly to help them. Many times with forgiveness, I think we just aren't seeing clearly. That's often our frustration with others, right? Is they aren't clearly seeing what they've done to us. There's just no way they could imagine how this has affected us. They're like, it was just that one time. You're like, do you know that's affected my life, my marriage, my friendships, my family? Do you know this has affected me? Right? Many times we can't see clearly. When we're willing to look at ourselves and address that first, then we're able to go to people with forgiveness in our own hearts for things that we have done. And that's the main point. And we start to set a tone for what happened. One of the great things that Joseph did was that he set almost a standard. Everybody was waiting to see what he would do. Right? Last week when he revealed himself, they're like, are we dead? Is he just going to kill us right here? Right? They're waiting. And he doesn't do it. But then the next time when his father dies, they're like, is he going to do it now? Was he just waiting for dad to go and now this is it? Here's what I've realized is that as we start to move towards forgiveness, they're waiting, right? We're all waiting for someone to forgive us or to do the first part. Joseph had a chance to set a tone. This is the standard. He said, I fear God. I'm going to give you life because I see what God's bigger picture is. Right? I'm going to forgive you, and we'll work on relationship. So the question is this, then, if we're going to move towards that, what can we do to start to move towards forgiveness in this way? The first thing is this: if you're a follower of Jesus, is to ask this: can I trust in God's plan more than I'm frightened by the path of forgiveness? Many of us are just afraid of what it's going to mean to forgive someone. What we have to do is get to a point where we can trust more in God's promise that he has our best in mind. But if we can trust more in that promise than we are scared of what's to come, if we can relinquish that control, we can live in that promise. It might be rocky, it might be tough, but God intended it for good. God is doing something, and our hearts moving towards forgiveness is a part of that. We're invited into it. We need to get our hearts in the right place for a follower of Jesus. If you're not a follower of Jesus, I'm sure that this is a relevant thing. Pain and forgiveness are parts of life. And I would ask, what is your standard for that? Like, how do you make decisions around that? How do we get there together? And have you ever thought about the fact that, a relationship with Jesus, receiving forgiveness, is a way that we could start by experiencing it ourselves? If you've never thought about the fact that God's not out to get you, right? He's been out to love you. He has your best in mind. Does that make a difference even how you would approach God and how you maybe would approach others as well? That forgiveness that he offers us is available anytime. We just have to ask him. We just ask him to be Lord of our lives. And it's a little bit the same. We're saying yes to needing forgiveness, knowing that we have sin, right? Being separated from God. And that brings us back into relationship with him. The path might be uncertain. What does it mean if I follow Jesus? Yep, life's going to change. You're going to have to think about some things differently. But your best interest is now in mind of the God of the universe, who loves you and wants a relationship with you. And once you receive that, right, the more we kind of understand the depth of forgiveness God has given us, the easier it is to extend it to other people. And here's what we have to do next, whether we're a follower of Jesus or we're considering that. I think we have to move towards people. Right? Often we're just, like I said, we're sitting around waiting for other people to make the first move. You might have to send a text. You might have to make a phone call, right? If that doesn't make sense because of the reconciliation piece, you may just have to sit down with God and say, God, here's where my heart is on it. Can you help me change? Don't just wait for God to do something. Ask him to do that work in your heart. No one's doing it for us at the grown-up table. Here's the thing that I think Joseph saw that I love is he looked back. He could have looked back on the last 10 years of his life and been like, I didn't get anything that I needed. In fact, I got like doubled down on the dose of like horrible things. I don't want that, so I'm just going to not do anything and just live the next 10 years. He would have almost assured at that point that his family never had anything different than that. His brothers would have lived with that guilt and shame. Right? That might have been generational for them. But here's what Joseph saw is that if he made the decision to forgive, the next 10 years could be something that could change drastically. I could again be in relationship with my brothers, right? Our children can now be in relationship, right? Generational change on one man's decision to forgive. It's incredible. You might have to move forward to someone. And here's what Joseph did at the end is he reassured them. Right? I guarantee that people in your life, they're not just not thinking about that. They're wondering, like Joseph's brothers. Is this finally it? Are they finally going to get their revenge now? Like anytime, because we just decide not to see each other or something, but eventually you like bump into each other. You're like, how's this going to go? Are they finally going to do it? Are they going to yell at us now? Are they going to hash this out at this family Christmas now? Right? Are we going to do this tonight? Like in front of, is this happening? Right? They wonder. Man, if you can move towards someone and reassure them, right? If you have that opportunity, if you can speak kindly to them, right? The goal is forgiveness of your heart. If reconciliation happens, it's amazing, but to move towards them in that way. If you're someone that's in need of forgiveness, maybe that opportunity is gone and you never got it. Maybe you've been living most of your life wishing that someone would ask for your forgiveness towards them or would apologize for what they've done, right? They'd seek your forgiveness. That's a painful weight. Here's what you need to know is that whatever circumstance you're in, like Joseph, he waited a long time. That promise was still true, right? Whether that person came to him or whether they came in. His brothers didn't offer forgiveness, by the way. It was Joseph on that part. When you're in that waiting, you need to know that God's with you, right? That he's going to uphold you. He's going to work in your life still. I'm going to pray for us here in a moment. The band's going to give us some time to think, but I ask you as you think about forgiveness, right? Think about the way that you think about forgiveness, right? Have I been thinking about this wrong? Right? Is there maybe a new way to think about forgiving people? Right? Is there work I need to do in my heart before I can forgive someone? Right? Is there work that I need to do so that I can even someone else can ask for my forgiveness? Right? Do I need to even approach that differently from either side? That promise of God to do good in your life is true. It's trusting that above all of the other things. Let me pray for us here. Jesus, thank you so much for the way that you love us. Thank you for the way that, God, you've forgiven us first, that you didn't just wait around for us to ask. God, you moved towards us. God, when we were at our worst, you offered us forgiveness. God, thank you that your heart has never wavered in how you think about us. God, you love us, we're your children, and you have our best in mind. God, for those of us in this room, would you help us as we seek to forgive people in our life? God, would you give us a heart for them? God, would you move us in that direction, no matter what the path looks like, whether reconciliation is part of it or not? God, would you help us to view them as your children who are also in pain? God, give us a heart of compassion. Not that we can't feel angry about it, that we can't feel like we missed out on something, God, or that we can't feel pain, but God, that our heart would move more and more towards people like yours. God, for those of us that need to receive even your forgiveness, help us to know that we don't need to live in guilt. We don't need to live in shame. But God, we get to live in your forgiveness. Knowing that you love us, you made a way for us to be in relationship with you. All we have to do is acknowledge who you are. God, make you Lord of our life and ask for that forgiveness. God, thank you that it's not complicated in that way. God, just be with us as we are people who need forgiveness from you. God, we need forgiveness from others, and we need to be people who give forgiveness. You know each person's pain in this room. Would you be near to them? Would you walk with them in what can be such a painful part of life? God, thank you that you aren't silent on this issue, but that you show us stories of people who have done this. God, you give us strategies for winning in this arena, God, with your help. God, we need you. We need your power to help us as we do this. We love you.